At dusk, one can see them gathering above the muted green metal siding that holds the glass slabs together. Opalescent, reflective, pushing something out of the boundaries of comfort in this city of glass. At first, there are a few black dots against the sky, a scattering, the way that you might scatter wet rice on the tabletop, accidentally making an array. They constellate in sound, curving around the height of the buildings, ornamenting their corners. And you can see it happening, like little upheavals here and there across the surface of the city. And you know that night is on its way, but the sky is still pale slate. Sometimes the city separates into layers. The Georgia Street Viaduct, like a long concrete spine rising above the ghosts of Hogan's Alley, torn down to make space for the viaduct, now empty, also to be torn down. And the on-ramp of the SkyTrain curving sveltely away from you with its low swish of bass sound. It is dusk again, and the frolic has already turned into a plain scrim, a gauze-like cloth of the still blue sky lit from behind by the setting sun. You see them as a changing shape against that sky, the way you see 1,000 dots and flecks making up the changing surface of the ocean, each with a heart. And so the current carries them further into the east of the city, across the invisible threshold of class. Sometimes you're coincident with them under the crow path, the tidal swell of it in these sinking, unsinking zones of meeting, unmeeting. They land in the tall Douglas fir trees by the memory house where you used to live, where you, fingertips on the windowsill, stand poised, watching the infinite gradations in the color of the mountains, bruised blue like plums by the sky. This is where you learn to observe change, how the change is always in the trees, even when the wind seems still. Crows. These are 3 time windows, 3 scenes from a manuscript of poetic ethology that I'm working on titled Pero, which softly constellates diasporic ecologies of place in relation to my own experiences of displacement. It takes up 2 bird roosts in 2 cities that coincide with my own migratory pathways. First to Vancouver, Canada, as a refugee during the Bosnian War in the 1990s, and then to New York 13 years later to study literature. The second of these I have already written about, and so I won't go into it at great length here, but it is useful to note that the second roost is at Brooklyn's Greenwood Cemetery, where a group of monk parakeets live. They, as the story goes, escaped from a crate at JFK Airport, where they were being shipped from Argentina to local pet shops in the New York area. Instead, they made their home at the cemetery, building a very large collective nest among the ornamentations that grace the Gothic Revival gate. Their screeching vocalizations and green feathers can be quite striking and especially surprising when witnessed on a first snowy day in winter. The second roost is in Burnaby, British Columbia, a suburb of Vancouver. In my opening scenes, I make 3 attempts to describe how the crows from across the city gather in small spurts and clusters, hovering and landing in the trees until more arrive, and they all fly off further and further towards the east, becoming gradually receding black dots in the faint blue distance of the sky. I have watched them for many years, tuning the rhythms of my activity to them. They operate like a strange clock, telling one the dusk is near. And this is a soft, biological clock, not a rigid, mechanical one. It adjusts itself to the rhythms of the seasons, responds to temperature and the levels of light. And I apologize if the videos are not of great quality. I actually have like real film footage of these roosts, but it didn't come back from the lab. So there's a part of Snail cinema that's maybe a kind of film. I don't know what I'm doing with yet, but that may be useful to know. Although possessing some variation, the path of the crows is somewhat regular. It moves through East Vancouver and onto Burnaby, where they will spend their nights together, thousands of them, in a McDonald's and a Costco parking lot, and the nearby wooded area along Still Creek. In the mornings, they fly back out from the collective of the roost, interspersed across the city to their own specialized food gathering areas. One can see some of them picking up mussel shells along Stanley Park's coastline at low tide and dropping them from the air onto the concrete walkway above, hoping that they will open. I have been to the roost to film the crows several times now, and there is something cosmic in watching their arrival as one spots them as tiny dots, which gradually increase in size and fly overhead. And it is hard to convey that there are thousands of them, some estimates suggesting as many as 10,000 in the winter nights of November, when the summer months of nesting season are long behind them. But what is even stranger is seeing people eating their cheeseburgers calmly among them as they stroll through the McDonald's parking lot on their way to their cars. And it is this kind of strange scene where everyone just seems to go about their life and there are 10,000 crows around them. This juxtaposition opens a number of questions for me about human and non-human histories of land use. A sense that the crows have a much longer memory of what this land had been, another layer of it beneath the pavement and the brightly lit glass of the car dealerships which adjoin the McDonald's parking lot. But even this is more complex than some romanticized idea of nature and place as locked in the stasis of deep time would allow. According to ornithologists Robert Butler and George Clow, the crows arrived here from another roost on the sparsely populated Boyer Island in September of 1974. The reason for this shift in behavior remains a mystery. Butler and Clulo write in their paper, History of the Establishment of a Large Northwestern Crow Roost in Burnaby, British Columbia. In the article, they trace instances of field observations of the crows, which in their sparseness acquire a kind of poetic quality, and I quote from their article. The flight through Burnaby on 20th September 1974 led to a red alder and cottonwood woodlot adjacent to the BC Institute of Technology, where 200 crows had gathered. At 1900 hours on 25th of September, crows entered the trees on the west side of BCIT, which is the BC Institute of Technology. And yet even this new roost becomes a site of displacement and instability when this forest is cut to build the car dealerships in the 1990s and early 2000s, and the crows move yet again to woodlots east of Willingdon Avenue. The construction of Costco in 2007 displaces the crows yet again to their current location. In a site-specific 2021 public artwork located in proximity to the roost, titled Crossroads, the Chinese-Canadian artist Julian Yizong Hao brings in the crows as a repeated motif. The artwork, consisting of a number of stained glass panels, references the artist's experiences growing up in this suburban area in the 1990s, with a particular emphasis on the fashions of the times, but also the flora and fauna of the area. In the notes to the piece, Howe states, the triptych depicts a movement from meditative incantation to dance to collaboration to collectivity that characterizes Burnaby as a site of historical and present cultural diversity. And then I quote again from these notes. The presence of the crows refers to the crow roost just a few minutes south of this site, to their collective consciousness, as well as to their symbolism as transformation. While I'm deeply interested in how this artwork opens a space for thinking about diasporic ecologies, I want to note also, and perhaps sidestep, a too easy alignment between human and animal entities that it suggests, in which human modes of collectivity are symbolically mirrored in the collectivity of the crows. Instead, I want to propose a different method for thinking about diasporic ecologies, one that considers the complex geometries of time and place that arise out of experiences of displacement, and in particular to ask how such experiences orient an attunement to the variegated rhythms that compose an ecosystem. I'm calling this method Snail cinema. I will now spend the rest of this talk theorizing this term by moving through different iterations through which my thinking about it has developed. And there are more crows. Okay. Snails. Onto snails now. My initial thinking about snail cinema arose out of an encounter with Jakob von Uexküll's book, A Foray into the Worlds of Animals and Humans, where he attempts to define what constitutes a moment for different organisms. Uexküll, an ethologist, brings up the example of an experiment with a snail, which is affixed to a strange apparatus. A scientist moves a stick in front of the snail, and depending on how fast or how slow the stick is moving, the snail experiences it as being in motion or being at rest. Drawing on this experiment, Uexküll comes to define a moment in a species-specific way. And this is his definition of a moment, I'm quoting from him, as the shortest segment of time in which the world exhibits no changes. This differs for different organisms, so that a human moment lasts 1/18 of a second, for instance, while in the snail's environment, a stick that moves back and forth 4 or more times a second is perceived by the snail as being at rest. This means that the perception time of the snail takes place at a speed of between 3 and 4 moments a second. This has as a result that all processes of motion take place much more quickly in the snail's environment than they do in our own. Even the snail's own movements do not seem slower to it than ours do to us. And that last long thing was a quotation that I didn't mark for you from Uexküll. One could think of this as a kind of snail animation or snail cinema, in that if one were making a snail film or cartoons for snails, one would have to pay attention to how many frames a second to play in order for the stick to appear as a moving object. As such, the very edges of the stick as an object within the snail universe are constituted in relation to time. For those who are not familiar with Uexküll's work, it is useful to know that he sees each organism as surrounded by a sheer garment of perception, a bubble-like world that is constituted by what an organism can perceive through the specificity of its senses. At the opening of A Foray into the Worlds of Animals and Humans, he takes his readers on a stroll on a sunny day before a flowering meadow in which insects buzz and butterflies flutter. Each of the organisms situated in this meadow is surrounded by a sheath of sensations that comprises its umwelt, or world. This perceptible island of the senses, of touch, smell, hearing, and sight, enfolds the animal like 4 envelopes of an increasingly sheer garment. Within this bubble world, the animal acts as an interpreter of various signs, rather than as an automaton mechanically responding to stimuli. And the modes of interpretation that the animal enacts are fundamentally subjective in that they take into account the relevance of particular features of the environment for the organism in question. A bee, for instance, encounters a flowering meadow as a series of circles and star shapes, which correspond to the open and closed shapes of the flowers. Another famous example is the tick. We'll jump to the tick. Another famous example is the tick, who cares about three notes, three aspects of sensation that flood its entire perceptual universe, and include the smell of butyric acid found in the mammal's sweat, the warmth of blood, and a sensitivity to sunlight, which allows it to climb up a grass stalk and wait for its prey to pass by. In light of the many conversations we've had over the last 2 days, it is interesting to note here that Uxkull's conception of the ecosystem is fundamentally musical, and he locates in this musicality of the universe the anti-mechanistic impulse that allows him to depart from a long-standing tradition in Western philosophy since Descartes of conceiving of animals as machines. Uxkull argues that the umwelten of different organisms do not interact mechanically, but are still connected according to a plan as the notes of an oratorio are harmonically connected. It is thus musical and not mechanical laws that we need to study if we want to find out about the laws of life. He extends this to suggest that the very form of the body of different organisms arises out of the requirements imposed by this harmonic or musical mutual interaction with the ecosystem. So it's almost kind of like the tune or the music is first, and then the forms of the bodies come out of it in some way to meet the needs of the music. I feel like that's how I understand him. He uses this language of music to talk about minute ecological interactions between organisms, such as the pollination of a flower by a bee. And I quote at length from him here, although I've also been quoting from him all along. The theme of the music for the honeybee is the collection of the nectar and pollen. A honeybee meadow is something very different from a human meadow. It is a honeybee composition made up of bee notes and is much easier to comprehend than our human umwelt compositions, end quote. I am moved by this rhythmic conceptualization of how different elements of an ecosystem interact, and also how processes of environmental degradation, such as climate change, can be understood as forms of temporal displacement, rhythmic shifts in the geometries of space and time, which cause organisms to fall out of sync with one another. This may occur as a consequence of how the rising temperatures brought about by climate change may affect the life cycles of different organisms in distinct ways, causing them to fall out of sync with one another. In this sense, displacement signals a misalignment occurring at what I refer to as the edges of time. In other words, edges of significant temporal windows within life cycles of different organisms that are no longer synchronous in ecologically relevant ways. Consider, for instance, so in a sense, I think of the relationship between time and temperature that's sort of shifted by climate change almost as a kind of falling apart of a musical composition of evolved relations, where organisms have come to meet one another, and suddenly there's a kind of disruption where, say, if you actually look at certain equations and say insect ecology, if you increase the temperature, the time changes. So if you were going to hatch at a certain moment as a caterpillar, you might hatch at a different moment because of the rising temperature. And so the leaves that you were going to eat, whose sort of trajectory has been shifted differently by the rising temperature, may not be around for you to eat them. So I'll sort of describe that in other words. But that's there's a kind of falling apart of a long-standing composition of relations, if you could think of it that way. Consider, for instance, this case of an ecosystem of a deciduous oak forest. Caterpillars prefer to feed on very young leaves, so their eggs normally hatch around the time of a bud burst. And then these caterpillars, in turn, are a prey species for varying foraging birds, such as blue tits and pied flycatchers, which act as prey for the sparrowhawks. In a paper published in the Journal of Animal Ecology, Christian Both and colleagues have shown that asynchronies have developed in these temporal patterns as a result of climate change, so that while caterpillars appear at their peak earlier in the season, the birds that feed on them do not advance the hatching of their eggs in time, and thus the interval in which their food needs are the greatest no longer coincides with the greatest abundance of their prey. While this study examined one ecosystem, applied more generally, one of the effects of climate change can be understood as a pattern of temporal displacements, a great falling out of sync of the many parts of a complex ecological symphony that had tied a multiplicity of species into the webs of entangled relation. Such temporal displacements, however, may also lead to forms of spatial displacement, as organisms shift the edges of their distribution in response to changing temperatures and other environmental variables. I explored some of these conceptions of thinking about organisms as possessing variegated rhythms in an earlier version of thinking through Snail cinema as a performative intervention, which took place at Brown University in the spring of 2022, and you can see some images from that performance. In that case, I was doing more of a performance with a number of people, and we actually had one figure who was wearing a snail costume on the stage and moving incredibly slowly throughout the performance as other things happen on the stage as well. And in this slide, you can see this earlier, perhaps more fun iteration of these concepts. So I just wanted to kind of put that in there as a kind of stage in the process of this paper. But I also imagine there might be another performance after the paper, so it's not sort of culminating in the paper necessarily. As I'm not a cinema scholar, I recognize that using the term cinema, while provocative, could take me down a rabbit hole. So I want to briefly here consider how this term connects to a whole tradition of experimental writing in the 20th and 21st centuries by bringing up Gertrude Stein, who's my favorite, who in her lecture, Portraits and Repetition, links her writing practice of constructing written portraits of various objects and people directly to the cinema. And here I'm quoting from Stein's lecture. In the beginning, I was doing what the cinema was doing. I was making a continuous succession of the statement of what that person was until I had not many things, but one thing. But then in a classic Stein fashion, she adds, I of course did not think of it in terms of the cinema. In fact, I doubted whether at the time I had ever seen a cinema. But, and I cannot repeat this too often, anyone is of one's period. And this, our period, was undoubtedly the period of the cinema. And of course, she's writing it in the first half of the 20th century. In the same lecture, Stein also links this writing practice directly to the animal when she brings up the example of a jumping frog, stating that writing in this way possesses a kind of liveliness. And I quote again, it is very like a frog hopping, she writes, and he cannot ever hop exactly the same distance or the same way of hopping at every hop. A bird singing is perhaps the nearest thing to repetition, but if you listen, they too vary their insistence. While I was not able to find any examples of Muybridge photographing jumping frogs, it is helpful to see one of his studies in relation to what Stein is saying about the frog and to consider a wider history that links the animal body to the cinema. Others, such as Akira Mizuta Lipid, have written about this link, and so I won't take us further down this path, but I acknowledge that there's a kind of archive of work behind me. In my own work, I have written a lot about Stein's various animals, and I also won't repeat that here, but I couldn't resist showing you some images of Stein with her favorite poodle Basket. In fact, there were multiple baskets, which made writing this paper I once wrote about Basket quite challenging, because as soon as one basket died, she would get another basket, and so you would have to sort of figure out which basket you were on in the various archival photographs. So I don't know what that says about repetition and Stein, but in any case. Okay, so now I'm moving towards the end. So we're on a kind of third movement of the talk, which is the mountain. With that said, the main thing that Stein accomplished in linking writing to both the cinematic and the animal at once was her insistence that there was no such thing as repetition, and this opened up a whole field of possibility in avant-garde writing that came after her, of developing an iterative poetic practice that could offer a close study of the unfolding of the most minute rhythms of temporal change. As an example, writing almost a century later in The Perfume Recordist, two contemporary poets, Lisa Robertson and Stacey Doris, theorized a procedure for documenting the luminous and changing detail of the present. And I quote from their essay. If, as wavists, we believe that change is not determinate, and if we can record the present in enough detail within a series of temporal frames, then varieties of change will emerge from the detail of sensing. This passage elaborates a methodology according to which description can act as a technology of amplification, flooding the delineated frame of the present with luminous grain of detail, and in turn rendering perceptible a more variegated sense of the kinds of change that are dynamically constituting the present, thereby opening the unfurling edge of this present towards the future in indeterminate ways. In other words, through this amplification in the detail of sensing, differentiated rhythms of change become evident, as varieties of change sift themselves into minute and heterogeneous temporalities of changing shapes and qualities. I argue that a devotion to such a poetic practice offers a way to tune the attention to the complexity and variegation of the ecological rhythms that make up various ecosystems as they undergo change. In closing, I also want to link such poetics to what I have previously outlined as the complex geometries of space and time that emerge out of the experiences of migration, and open up a space for thinking about diasporic ecologies. In this sense, the methodology of Snail cinema seeks to undo the essentialist idea of nature as rooted in a stable understanding of place, which has often served to naturalize contingent histories of conquest and domination, such as those associated with settler colonialism or the policing of the borders of the nation state. An example would be the discourse that is often used around the description of native and invasive species, where the ecological impact of new species that have been introduced to the environment is often painted in xenophobic terms. Rather than beginning with this tradition of thinking about place, the critical methodology of Snail cinema begins with thinking about displacement and the way in which the temporal rhythms opened up by experiences of displacement can offer a different lens for examining and living with the temporalities of ecological change. As such, Snail cinema assumes what Sarah Ahmed has called a migrant orientation. While such an orientation arises through, and I quote, unsettling arrivals, Ahmed does not locate it strictly within the migrant body, but within the process through which places and bodies are mutually co-created through relation. And now I actually quote at length. Spaces are not exterior to bodies. Instead, spaces are like a second skin that unfolds in the folds of the body. Migration involves re-inhabiting the skin, the different impressions of a new landscape, the air, the smells, the sounds, which accumulate like points to create lines, or which accumulate like lines to create new textures on the surface of the skin. Close quote. In assuming a migrant orientation, Snail cinema engages with how the ecological dimensions of place are constituted through histories of displacement, arrival, and encounter. In closing, and I'm really closing now, I turn now to the work of the Arab-American poet and painter Etel Adnan. One of the things that interests me deeply about Adnan's work is how, after immigrating to America from Lebanon in the 1950s to teach philosophy, she turns to an iterative contemplation of the landscape of California in her work, focusing in particular on the sea and on Mount Tamalpais, and how these landscapes, which are so directly observationally present in her work, also gesture towards a kind of indirect longing for other landscapes that is produced by displacement and migration. She writes of Mount Tamalpais as a constant point of reference and suggests that, I quote, geographic spots can become spiritual concepts. As she spends years going, coming back, turning around the mountain, staring at it, walking all over it, and dreaming. Again, a quote. I'm particularly interested in investigating the formal and temporal effects of Adnan's iterative, almost devotional method of observation, and placing them in dialogue with the superimpositions that begin to occur between not only the land and the sea in her work, but also distant and proximate landscapes. Or as she writes so poetically in her book, Journey to Mount Tamalpais, quote, like a chorus, the warm breeze has come all the way from Athens and Baghdad to the bay by the Pacific route, its longest journey. It is the energy of these winds that I used when I came to these shores, obsessed, followed by my homemade furies, Erinyes, and such potent creatures. And I fell in love with the immense blue eyes of the Pacific. I saw its red algae, its blood-colored cliffs, its pulsating breath. The ocean led me to the mountain. Oh no, I could have given you that quote. Oh no, yes, I should have given you this. No, sorry, I'm like losing my thread. Okay, I want to stay here with these problems of duration and incremental scale of attention as they manifest in Adnan's writing, and particularly her studies of Mount Tamalpais, as well as her observation of the sea and weather phenomena. In a text, To Be in a Time of War, written by Adnan in 2003 during the American invasion of Iraq, she tracks the smallest of actions that unfold in her life in the United States while she's witnessing the war from a distance as it makes headlines in the media. And I quote again, to wake up, to stretch, to get out of bed, to dress, to stagger towards the window, to be ecstatic about the garden's beauty, to observe the quality of the light, to distinguish the roses from the hyacinth, to wonder if it rained in the night, to establish contact with the mountain, to notice its color, to see if the clouds are moving, to stop, to go to the kitchen, to grind some coffee, to light the gas, to heat water, hear it boiling, to make the coffee, to shut off the gas, to pour the coffee, to decide to have some milk with it, to bring out the bottle, to put the milk in the aluminum pan, to heat it, to be careful, to pour, to mix the coffee with the milk, to feel the heat, to bring the cup to one's mouth, to drink again, to face the day's chores, to stand and go to the kitchen, to come back and put the radio on, to bring the volume up, to hear that the war against Iraq has started. In this passage, Adnan divides or parses her actions into the smallest of units, so that each somatic gesture is articulated from a moment in which the body stretches to the way that she lifts a cup of coffee to her mouth. Something in this incrementality of describing actions brings up the question of what constitutes the edges of an action, what makes it discrete. This fragment also crystallizes Adnan's careful attention to the environment around her, the blooming of different spaces of flowers, roses and hyacinth, the passing of clouds, and the attunement to the mountain, specifically Mount Tamalpais, a mountain that Adnan refers to as her mountain, and returns to again and again in multiple visual and poetic works through acts of iterative observation and description. Okay, I'm on the last paragraph. One of the central questions that I'm moving towards here involves asking why this specific mountain on the coast of California becomes so central to Adnan as a writer originally from Lebanon who arrives to the American landscape to study and teach philosophy and brings to her perceptions of the landscape what Ahmed calls a migrant orientation. As I have suggested, Ahmed pays particular attention to how such an orientation attunes one to the different impressions of a new landscape, the air, the smells, the sounds, which accumulate like points to create lines, or which accumulate like lines to create new textures on the surface of the skin. This attunement involves a sensory openness to the environment surrounding the migrant perceiver, and yet this openness is always already located within a displacement, so that other distant landscapes one has left form a kind of palimpsest with the one that is being perceived directly in the present. But rather than generating nostalgia for that lost landscape, Adnan's writing opens the senses to the smells, sights, sounds, and textures of the new environment one finds oneself in. Displacement in Adnan's work operates in yet another register beyond the palimpsestic by creating a hyper-focused form of environmental attention directed onto the specific landscape of California that surrounds her, and in particular elements within it, such as weather, sea, and the mountain. It is this relationship between attention and displacement that lies at the heart of the argument that I'm moving towards in trying to conceptualize Snail cinema as a method for thinking about diasporic ecologies. Thank you.